They've been implemented and they've been sustained. So, on a national level, as I saw and participated in, reform can be achieved and it can be maintained. Likewise, institutional law reform bodies have achieved much as a result of their reports, both in Australia and New Zealand. Amongst these, the ALRC has been one of the most successful in the world, utilised by succeeding governments of different political outlook. The ALRC is still at work and its reports are treated with respect by the courts and lawyers and governments in a way that would have seemed incredible back in 1975. Still, to achieve institutional reform at a global level is much more difficult. So much is demonstrated by the endless arguments about reform of the United Nations organisation and the comparatively little progress that has been made under successive Secretaries-General to achieve even slight reforms within the United Nations. The progress now facing the EPG for the reform of the Commonwealth of Nations presents a big challenge. Agreeing upon and securing proposals that will gain acceptance at the CHOGM meeting in Perth in October 2011 will be difficult, and success is by no means assured. It may be expected that smaller and developing countries of the Commonwealth, which are very numerous, being 31 of the 54 member states, will demand recognition by the EPG and the Commonwealth of the integral role of the right to development as an element in universal human rights, and a demand that the Secretary-General of the Commonwealth become a kind of global spokesman for the interests of the smaller Commonwealth states at meetings of the new global groupings of the world's richer and more powerful countries, notably the G20. 5 nations of the Commonwealth, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India and South Africa, have a seat in the G20. The proposal for a more active Commonwealth role there may, of course, run into resistance from the G20 themselves because of the ramifications for other potential applicants to participate. It may also run the risk of diverting the Commonwealth from attention to the present institutional challenge, namely the better implementation of the repeatedly declared values of the organisation and their translation into regular, effective, practical action. So should the Commonwealth not concentrate on improving the machinery it already has in place in the CMAG, the Committee of Ministers? Should it not first strive to uphold the values that it's regularly proclaimed before it takes on any larger economic and geopolitical challenges, however integral they may seem to be in theory or practice for the attainment of human rights for all Commonwealth citizens? As one member of the EPG said at its first meeting, I have yet to see a country which is poor, which has a full raft of protections for human rights. This is the tricky problem that has to be addressed by the EPG. Perhaps in the contrasting demands of the older, developed countries of the Commonwealth and of the younger, developing countries of the Commonwealth may lie the seeds of a common agreement. The long-term attainment of practical human rights for Commonwealth citizens will never be assured whilst there is poverty, homelessness, lack of access to water, education and basic health care remaining features of daily life in many Commonwealth countries. By the same token, in the face of the activities of human rights denying countries of the Commonwealth, it may be better to exclude some of the more egregious offenders for a time until they get their human rights record and conduct into better shape. But is the Commonwealth ready and willing to face up to this challenge and to decide that such action should be taken? So much easier to drift along without confronting such needs for structural change. The dialogue of the EPG continues. Its report will be produced for the CHOGM meeting in October 2011. And even when the report is produced, the adoption of any reform and its successful implementation throughout the global community of the Commonwealth of Nations will be a big challenge. To focus on the way ahead requires the concentration by the EPG on what is attainable and what can be achieved by careful strategic decisions. The EPG needs to heed the warnings of Eric Patashnik in his book Reforms at Risk: What Happens After Major Policy Changes Are Enacted. Although stated in the political context of legislation enacted by the Congress of the United States, much of what he says is relevant to the deliberations of the EPG in the still more difficult challenges of achieving reform in an institution that functions, as the Commonwealth does, at the global level. So what does Patashnik say? Quote, "Like a child's room," writes former Treasury official Eugene Sturele, "one has little expectation that when the reform is cleaned up, it'll stay tidy forever. By the same token, permanent improvements can often be made along the way. Just as parents learn to pick some battles with their children and to avoid others, so idealistic yet savvy reformers must reflect on which potential reform targets are worth all the effort. Because battles over reforms sometimes get caught up in broader partisan and ideological conflicts," Patashnik continues, "it is easy to lose sight of the fact that reform decisions also reflect normative tensions between the values of commitment and discretion. The often circuitous paths that reforms take matter not only because they create winners and losers at certain moments in time, but because they shape the possibilities for governance in the future. Strategic leaders will want to think carefully about the reform legacies that they leave to their successors." Now, these words, written in the particular context of securing lasting reforms to the tax code of the United States of America, have a more general relevance, I believe. They carry an instruction for national reformers, but also, I think, for those who seek to change international institutions to reflect more clearly the altered world in which those institutions now operate. The altered world of the Commonwealth of Nations is one in which the trappings and realities of British imperial power that once held the family together have retreated almost to, if not to, vanishing point. And even the trappings of British symbolism are no longer particularly potent. What is left is nothing more than a body held together by history, language, sentiment, and perceived current utility. Yet it is a body that continues to proclaim its allegiance to values that are, in truth, vitally important for peace, security, and equity throughout the world. Ultimately, that is what universal fundamental human rights represent, as the Charter of the United Nations recognised at the very beginning in 1945. It is why the Commonwealth so gladly embraces those rights and asserts that they are the core values that it upholds. It is why it has created an organisational structure to ensure the attainment of such important values. It is difficult in an ever-watching world to get away for too long with grandiose declarations followed up by seriously inadequate performance. Yet this is what the Commonwealth of Nations has so far stumbled along trying to do. Reform in an international organisation can't be imposed against the will of at least most of the members. Effectively, it has to be agreed. At the heart of securing agreement is the need for a conviction, at least on the part of a sufficient number of the participating governments of CHOGM, that it is in their interests, as well as the correct thing to do, that they should reform, or that the game is up and that they cannot continue to go on declaring one thing and doing another, to declare human rights as a fundamental value, but to deny them repeatedly and to do so publicly and flagrantly in their domestic policies. The time is fast approaching when the Commonwealth of Nations will need to make a choice. Upon the choice that's made may well depend the survival of the organisation, certainly in anything like the form it presently manifests. So much seems to be inherent in the many responses of disillusionment and even despair expressed in the Commonwealth conversation conducted by the Royal Commonwealth Society and in many other contributions urging effective institutional reform. It's at this moment in my life that I wish that Dr. John Paterson were still with us. If he were, I think he would focus his sharp intellect on the problem. He would define its contours and possibilities. He would express the trade-offs that will be necessary to achieve reform, and he would then outline the strategies and the tactics that are essential to ensuring that any proposed reforms are made and then endure. It is reformers of his ilk who push the world along in a trajectory towards greater justice, efficiency and respect for one another. And this is why he is honoured in this lecture, and it's why I am honoured to be asked to speak in this series and to endorse and remember his memory. Of one thing we can be absolutely sure. John Paterson would not have said, "Give up, it's too difficult, reform can't be achieved." That would simply not be in his nature, nor should it be in ours. As a useful link amongst many states and people that history has fortuitously presented to us, the Commonwealth of Nations is certainly worth preserving, particularly, we might say, to Australia and New Zealand, to whom it affords a regular link with countries that might otherwise be outside their main orbits of contact. However, the Commonwealth needs effective and lasting institutional reform to survive. If there's sufficient will, it should be possible to secure such reforms. But is that will attainable? Or will its members rather that it atrophy into insignificance because they're unwilling to face the painful and competing realities of what they need to do to ensure survival in this post-imperial century? You can now give me a long round of applause. Okay. Well, this is now an opportunity for me to get something back from you. Assembled here are all the smartest people in institutional government, all the cleverest people from trans-Tasman world and beyond, who have all sorts of brilliant ideas of how to solve every problem, or at least many problems in government. So does anybody have any questions, comments or observations? This is a democracy. You don't have to agree with what I've said. Any questions?
Well, before democracy sets in, I had one.
Yes.
And that's before the smart people start. I just wanted to make a connection. It's not a one-to-one connection, but there is some connection with a lot of work that has been done on studying networked governance. There's a lot of literature on that, and it also extends into the international area, because when people look at some kind of international problem, they tend to start off by thinking, well, let's have an international law, an international agency, some international principles, and we'll apply them. This is a very limited way of getting results on international problems. And if you look at the way that the world works, actually most of the solutions to international problems, or many of them, are done through